Numéro 91 du Comité permanent.
Welcome to meeting number 91 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Official Languages in accordance with Standing Order 1083 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, January 29, 2024. The committee is resuming its study of language obligations related to the process of staffing or making appointments to key positions. Now, we are, of course, all in the habit of doing these hybrid meetings, so I will just skip through the reminders for everyone who's on Zoom. We have our witnesses here in the room. I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We start with Ms. Geneviève Tellier, professor here at the University of Ottawa, appearing as an individual. And from the Public Service Alliance of Canada, we have Mr. Alexander Sidas, Regional Executive Vice President for the National Capital Region, as well as Mr. Pierre-Samuel Proux, who is a Senior Research Officer. As you know, well, maybe you don't know, this will be news to you, Mr. Sidas has been here before, right? Yeah. So you're going to have 5 minutes each for your opening remarks, and then we will go into the question and answer period. There will be questions by each of the political parties. Ms. Tellier, I will be strict with the timing so that we get through 2 rounds of questioning. I am giving the floor over to you for the next 5 minutes. I will keep this short. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to testify as part of its study on linguistic obligations in the staffing process or in making appointments to key positions. I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I am as part of the public administration program. I am therefore very familiar with staffing issues in the public service as well as with the challenges of implementing public policy. As you know, no doubt, the University of Ottawa is a bilingual institution, and in fact, it's the largest bilingual French-English university in the world. So I'm quite familiar with the issues involved in the 2 languages existing together in the workplace. I'm also very familiar with the challenges associated with defending a language with a precarious status, such as French in Ontario, as well as the obstacles to be overcome when teaching a second language. And I regularly comment on current news through columns published in Le Droit, Franco-Presse, and Radio-Canada. Through these columns and my contributions, I regularly deal with language issues. One of these columns received a lot of attention when it was published. It was published on July 9, 2021 in the Le Droit, and it had to do with the appointment of the Governor General. I wrote then, and I still maintain this position today, that the Governor General's lack of knowledge of the French language was extremely damaging, not for the Francophonie in Canada in general, but specifically for the Francophonie outside Quebec. Francophones outside Quebec have been fighting for years to demonstrate that knowledge of French in bilingual organizations is not just an asset, but an essential skill. This nomination destroyed years of effort and struggle. This proof is in my own organization. There is rather proof in my own organization where bilingualism in senior management positions is no longer considered an essential skill or in the creation of English-only university programs. This appointment also implicitly insinuated that it was not possible to associate the French-speaking world with diversity, and yet recent appointments to high public office prove just the opposite. Just think of Justice Michel Aubin-Sawin or the Lieutenant Governor of Quebec, Ms. Manon Janot. While promoting and protecting bilingualism requires strong leadership at the highest level of public administration, it also requires commitment from all employees. They must be sensitive to the issue of languages and bilingualism. This sensitivity needs to be present as early as possible in the career path of employees, especially those aspiring to higher positions in the hierarchy. In an ideal world, bilingualism should be required at the time of hiring for all positions, and if that is not possible, then second language teaching should be introduced as soon as possible. The longer we wait, the more difficult it becomes. I can illustrate this case by talking about our Masters of Public Administration program offered at the University of Ottawa. This program is unique in Canada because one of its objectives is to train future bilingual public servants. We have adopted an asymmetrical approach to achieve this. English-speaking students are required to take a course in French. The reverse, however, is not required. French-speaking students can register for courses in English, but they are not obliged to do so. This requirement is a challenge for most English-speaking students, but the results are there for all to see. In fact, many of these students choose to enroll in other courses offered in French at a later date. This case shows that we have to overcome initial obstacles and be persistent in our policies. This concludes my presentation, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much, Ms. Tellier. And for the Public Service Alliance of Canada, I don't know which one of the two is going to be presenting, but Mr. Silas, you have the floor for 5 minutes. Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. I'd like to thank you for your invitation for us to appear at this committee. My name is Alex Silas, and I am the Regional Executive Vice President. I live in the Vanier neighborhood. I have Mr. Pierre-Samuel Proux with my colleague who is with me, a Senior Research Officer. The Alliance of the Public Service of Alliance of Canada is one of the biggest unions, and we represent thousands of employees. Our members work in federal agencies, universities, casinos, community service centers, and airports. We are trying to defend the rights of workers, including the work to write in the language of choice, of their official language of choice. When it comes to recruiting, language training, we are also very much involved. And despite the progress that's been made, there are still challenges. We are seeing that government doesn't really seem very enthusiastic about improving bilingualism in the federal public service to offer better services to Canadians and making sure that every employee is comfortable working in their language of choice.
Is encouraged and supported by the employer, and we believe it's the federal government's duty to provide the necessary tools to make this happen. A public service where bilingualism is encouraged means, for example, a team where communication flows smoothly and without misunderstandings, a more inclusive, diversified workplace, and the elimination of language barriers and language insecurity. If managers and people in key positions don't speak official languages, both official languages, it's more than likely that the employees under them will work in only one of the languages, not both. I think it's also important to point out that bilingualism in the federal public service is crucial for ensuring that Canadians can interact with their government in the official languages of their choice. This helps strengthen citizens' confidence in government institutions and promotes linguistic inclusion at all levels of society. PSAC is proposing several measures to improve bilingualism in the federal public service, in addition to new provisions for Indigenous employees who express themselves orally or in writing in an Indigenous language in the course of their duties. L'amélioration de la prime du bilinguisme est un des exemples.
Improving the bilingualism premium is also a good example, but it has not been improved in many years. It's been at the same level since it was introduced. We're talking about more than 25 years. Despite our repeated requests, the government refuses to increase this bonus. And in a report in 2019, they even suggested removing this bonus, which we find completely unacceptable. If the government really wants to support official languages, we believe that the bonus needs to be increased in order to really value the work being done and offer more language formation of high quality to encourage both English and French speakers to improve their second language. We are also suggesting support for Indigenous languages for those who use these languages in the public service, and that will also be meaningful for reconciliation. The Treasury Board and our labor union got together to work with hundreds of employees, federal employees who use Indigenous languages, and their contribution to the public service should be highlighted. The federal government, as an employer, should set the example and officially recognize the contribution of its staff who are using Indigenous languages in the fulfillment of their services to serve the communities that they are serving. And if the government really wants to reinforce both official languages, then they should make language training more accessible in a more proactive manner. We need more language training, both for English and French speakers, to improve their second language, which will make them even more capable to deliver services. We also need language training to overcome barriers and to allow employees and equity-seeking groups to have access to management positions. At the moment, Indigenous members are underrepresented in these leadership positions, and they do not really have full access to language training. We also ask that the Treasury Board stop contracting out language training and concentrate on creating its own training program, including public service employees. And the same for translation services, that should also not be contracted out. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'd also like to thank interpreters for their work. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Merci, Monsieur Silas.
Thank you, Mr. Silas. All of our witnesses use their time wisely. It looks like they want to answer many questions. Okay, so here's how this is going to work. We're going to go to each of the political party in the first round for 6 minutes. It will be an interactive question and answer session, and we start with the first vice chair of this committee from the Conservatives, Mr. Godin. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here this morning. It is quite cold outside next to the Ottawa River. I'm going to start with Ms. Tellier. I was about to say Ms. Le Tellier, but that's a thing of the past. It was music to my ears when you spoke about the Governor General. And you said in your opening remarks that it was extremely damaging what happened. And you said that they should lead by example. How do you consider the influence of the highest office in Canada? And this is nothing against the individual, of course. We're not blaming the individual, but this person is sitting at the highest office in Canada, and it is a representative post, represents a bilingual country, and bilingual English and French. As I often say, this person is bilingual, but she does not speak French. So how can we repair this damage? Well, there could be, of course, two ways of going about this. The soft approach and the hard approach. The soft approach would be to take into account what has happened and to say this will not happen again. But I've been looking at the recent nominations of lieutenant governors in the different provinces. We don't see this in Quebec, but the federal government seems to have taken this into account. At least for Ontario, there is a Franco-Ontarian who was nominated to this position. So one might hope that this will not happen again. And we should continue to, of course, underline the importance of this issue. So that's the soft approach. Now, the tough approach would be to change the legislation and make things more clear at the tribunals. There's room for more clarification, but we can make it explicit and to say that at the Supreme Court of Canada or Governor Generals or Lieutenant Governors, they have to speak English and French. We don't want to take things there, but if there's inaction, they might be the only way of solving this. Thank you, Ms. Tellier. When the Governor General was nominated, of course, it caused a whole debate and it was not really acceptable, but you mentioned that in the only bilingual province, there was a unilingual Governor General. So the actions did not follow the words. There's no willingness, there's no action. And we're seeing this. Now, the Official Languages Act that we currently have, is it doing its job? Does it provide the necessary tools? And we don't know what department because there's a lot of confusion when it comes to who has what responsibility. There's the Treasury Board, there's Canadian Heritage, there's Justice, there's the Privy Council. So there are a lot of loopholes that would allow politicians to pass the buck or the responsibility to someone else. How do we deal with this? That's a great question. The Act has just been amended, and the Commissioner of Official Languages has been saying that we still need time to see new results. But when you have new legislation, the faster you act to introduce the intention of the legislation, the better the results you have. So if you wait for things to go back to normal, then there won't be too many changes. So it takes a lot of strong leadership and quick intervention and in the introduction of measures to change things. That's how you get results. So you have to see, again, the work of this committee is also very, very important, and the committee should be very clear on the types of the changes that you'd like to see. You maybe should contact the Commissioner of Official Languages on this, but you shouldn't wait, and you should hold the government to account. So leadership should come from the highest instances. In my opening remarks, I was also referring to the higher levels of the public sector. So the highest level was what I was referring to. So the implementation should be quick through the regulations. Let's talk about that efficiency and quickness. There's an act that we have, and there are tools available to the commissioner. There are fines. That's not the wording used in the act, but that is roughly what that tool is. And you said we need to act quickly. So complaints should be filed, but they're not filed. And you also talked about being quick in reacting to the situation. And the president of the Treasury Board told us here at the committee that it might take up to 3 years to introduce the regulations. So as you were saying, does that not show a lack of willingness on the part of this government? I feel compelled to agree with you. It appears that there's no urgency on the matter. Despite many years of complaints, the situation is not really getting better. So pressure should be put on the government from all circles, including Francophone communities or official language minority communities, because that is the minority. The minority aspect of these communities is really important. So it's concerning at the moment. And the act, of course, the adoption of the act also took quite a long time. Ms. Tellier, what would be some of the methods that could be used to change the situation? We made the observation, but what would you recommend to us as lawmakers to take action and to protect French? That's a great question, but we will have to wait for the next round to get the answer. Minus 5 seconds. Well, I told you I was going to be strict with the timing, but do not forget your answer to this question. Second question will come from the Liberal Party. And Mr. Iacono, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here this morning. Very cold morning. This might be the coldest day in a while. Ms. Tellier, language skills, so the operational knowledge of the 2 official languages of Canada, should it be an obligation in hiring to the high levels of the public service in Canada? Yes, and not just for them. Our approach should be, our default approach should be that bilingualism should be requested from everyone. And then we should proceed by elimination and then go, okay, in such and such circumstances, it might not be necessary. But bilingualism should always be top of mind. And when the federal government is a bilingual institution, if it's a bilingual institution, then that is an important factor when it comes to organizing our business in this institution. So yes, for the higher echelons, and bilingualism before being nominated to positions, because there are cases where individuals learn French after the fact, but as they're learning French, that means some people are not being served in French. And people who are in some of these positions, if they're not bilingual, what measures should be taken to make sure that these people become bilingual? Well, it's quite complicated. You have to be sensitive when it comes to the circumstances leading to the nomination of these people. So after the fact, if you say we've changed the rules, you will end up losing your employment. I don't think that's the right way to proceed. So we have to take into account the circumstances around these nominations. And we might say this is not going to happen in the future, but we can, of course, try to see if training can be provided, but this should be made a priority. What about the operational needs? If this one person has the capacity, has the skills, and other people don't, in a hiring window, what should be the method? Well, do they have the capacities if they're not bilingual? That is the problem, because bilingualism, yes, it's essential, but it's at the bottom of the list. It should be at the top of the list. And we should stop saying that because they don't speak French or English, they still have the competencies. No, this person does not have the competencies, so we should change the way we approach, and we should say, okay, these are the skills, and this person does not have the skills, and if we still want this person, absolutely, we should make sure that they end up acquiring these competencies, but before they are appointed to a certain position, and there might be exceptions, of course. I'm fully in agreement with you, but during the hiring window, if you don't have anyone who's qualified and the only thing that's holding someone back is the language, what do? Do we wait for someone who has a skill as well to present themselves? Because sometimes you don't have people and you need to hire someone, and then the person might end up learning the other language and they have the other skills and competencies that they can use on the job. Well, I'll challenge you on that, and I'll say, well, show me that it does not exist. We hear that very quickly and very easily. I mean, show me that there's no one else who can do the job. And why is French the skill that should be at the bottom of the list, and why are some other skills at the top of the list? If you have a candidate who's bilingual but they don't have certain skills, well, I mean, maybe you can concentrate on training that person on some of those other lacking skills if they are bilingual. So you're checking all the boxes except French. I mean, look at it as a whole, and French shouldn't be at the bottom of the stack. I will be sharing my time with my colleague. Microphone, please. Well, Francophonie versus the diversity, that's a point you made in your opening remarks. Can you elaborate on that? Well, in the Francophone community, we often hear, again, going back to the question of skills, diversity becomes an important matter. So why do we not have diversity in the Francophone community? Look at what's happening in Quebec or elsewhere. Look at the Francophonie in Toronto. It's extremely diversified, and I see this in my courses as well, in my classrooms as well. I teach in both languages, but French classes or French courses in Ottawa are more diversified than the opposite, than the English. So show me that there is no diversity in the Francophone community. Does this tie in with what's happened with the Governor General? Well, that's the most visible example, but I can give other examples as well, but it's not the only one. Mr. Silas from New Brunswick. Welcome, sir. Very quickly, you were saying less than 15 seconds, Mr. Sanson. So a unilingual Anglophone supervisor supervising a group of Francophones, was that the case you referred to?
Absolutely. If there's just one person who only speaks English, everyone switches to English. That's an excellent question. You managed to slip that one in. And then third question is going to come from the Bloc Québécois, who's the second Vice Chair. Over to you, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. Each time I hear it's urgent, it's urgent. I've heard that since I first came to the Parliament, but it seems that nothing's really moving ahead. Do you think we're making progress, or are we going backwards? I'm putting the question to you. Both, I would say. We're making progress in the public arena. There is more sensitivity to this question. People are more alive to the linguistic issue in the Canadian population, so there's progress. And knowledge of both languages has also improved. For example, in Ontario, the French immersion education programs are very popular here. So people are more sensitive. However, when we look at the results from Stats Canada, in Quebec, bilingualism is really going up, in particular amongst Francophones, but in the rest of Canada, bilingualism of English speakers is not going up. It's stuck at the same level. What I wanted to see was that we're now tracking that question. We're attentive to that, so that's progress. So as you said, in the public arena. But are we making progress within the federal government machinery? I don't think so. But one of the big issues is that we don't have enough data. So one recommendation that I put to the committee is that you really need to push for data. You need to have evidence. But at the same time, it seems that we've got lots of studies out there. And often, well, Stats Canada for a long time was basically denying that there was a decline in French. Now there's been a bit more opening on this question. So now we're hearing people talking about it more in the public arena, but we'll have to see what happens next. And now turning to the PSAC. So for these appointments and for staffing, where there are language obligations, well, we've had various discussions on that. And we've been told, why not require knowledge of French from the outset? Because, as you said, Ms. Tellier, we accept people, it seems, who are not equipped with French skills, and we hope that they're going to learn French, and then we see that it's not really efficient. So why don't we require that from the outset, from the get-go? And as Mr. Iacono said earlier, if we don't find people, what do we do here? It's a question of chicken and egg. If we ask for that requirement, people will get it. But if we don't make this a requirement and say you can have language courses later, I don't think that really works. I agree with Ms. Tilly. It needs to be an acquired skill rather than a secondary skill. But I'd like to say that French and English can be learned. That's why we're asking for more training opportunities, because officials on both sides, English and French-speaking officials, want to develop their bilingual capacity to be able to make progress in their career in the public service. Yes, it's true there needs to be more language training. But I think that from the get-go, we need to ask and require knowledge of French, because otherwise we've seen what's happened with the Governor-General, for example. There are some people where it's not just a question of training. Some people don't really have that linguistic aptitude, and it's very difficult for them. For example, the president of Air Canada, who apparently is taking lessons every day, but it wasn't really working for him. Now, we had the vice president from Quebec, where said there was systemic discrimination that was deeply anchored in the federal machinery and always assumes that everything should take place in English first, and that was the case in Quebec as well. Do you think there's been a change there, or are we going backwards rather than forwards? Well, I think we can see that across Canada, where we have Francophone there throughout the country, and often there's this unfairness in terms of promotion opportunities, and there are more high management positions that are posted unilingually in English or bilingually, but French unilingual positions are very rare. And also when it comes to training opportunities, there's more opportunities for English-speaking people wanting to develop their French on the other way around. And in terms of documents, often it's just sent out in English. Sometimes there's drafts that are just sent out in English, and then when the Francophones say, look, I can't comment on that, it's just in English, then they're told, look, you'll get the final version in French. Don't worry, it'll be translated. But you can't give your feedback. You can't get feedback from the French speakers if the text is just in English. We see that in the government as well within various commissions, and we get reports coming out just in English. So if that's what's happening in the government, imagine what's happening in the private sector. The government's meant to set the tone and lead by example. Then on language training, we've heard from specialists in this matter. And now you said there should be a centralized model for this. I think there was a training school. Sorry, it's hard for me to hear myself speak, actually. But as I was saying, we were told that there was a centralized language training. There was a training school initially, and then it was decentralized to save costs. And then there can be outsourcing in the departments for language training, so quality has gone down. Do you think we need to come back to the former model, where it's a bit like the Translation Bureau did in the past? Should we come back to one public service language school that would cover all of the departments? Absolutely is the answer. When it comes to outsourcing, there's cost savings in the short term, but studies show that in the long term it costs more. So workers within the federal public service are doing important work. So it's important to invest in the language training services within the public service so that they can have specific training geared to the public service. And now fourth question will come from the NDP. 6 minutes. You have the floor, Ms. Ashton. Thank you very much. And thank you also to our witnesses today. I've got questions for the PSAC. You've said that in negotiations with the Treasury Board, you did for a review of the directive on bilingualism to go from $800 to $3,000. Now, why do you think the Treasury Board has not accepted to actually increase that amount? And why do you think an increase in this directive anchored amount would actually reinforce bilingualism within the public service? Thank you. Well, I think we'd all agree that $800 in 2024 is not the same thing that back in 1977. I think there's a lack of will here to really give value to the contribution that the two languages make to public service and recognise the importance of bilingualism to better represent and serve the Canadian population. So I think there's a lack of will and they're not giving value to both official languages. Okay, so when it comes to well-paid jobs, how can that contribute to reinforcing the capacity to attract and retain the bilingual staff that's needed in the public service? We know there's a great deal of outsourcing in general, not just when it comes to language training, but there's a great deal of outsourcing within the public service that's taking place. Do you think that that's harmful in terms of efforts being made to retain bilingual people and attract bilingual people into the public service? Absolutely, there's a great deal of problems with retention. Here we're talking about investing in the importance of both official languages and recognition of Indigenous languages also in the public service. So yes, it's an investment. It's a significant investment because it would lead to a better quality of service in official languages vis-à-vis the Canadian population.
And the PSAC has been very clear on the importance of recognizing and valuing Indigenous languages in the public service. Advocacy groups say there are barriers to learning French in marginalized communities in parts of, say, Western Canada, where I am in, and particularly in Indigenous communities. How do we fix this? How do we address the systemic gaps in language training so that we can strengthen bilingualism in the civil service, so that we can also value what Indigenous language-speaking public servants or potential public servants could bring to the table? Do you have any recommendations?
Absolutely. Look, there was a joint study between the employer and the union that showed that there are hundreds of workers in the federal public service who use an Indigenous language in writing or orally every day to serve the communities that they're in. This is not something that, this is something they have to do. This is something they need to do to communicate with these communities. And it's not being recognized at all. It's not included in the bilingualism bonus, which needs to be increased. So, yes, I think including that in the bilingualism bonus, and then again, back to increasing opportunities for training. These are trainable skills. These are skills that people want to learn, but there needs to be more opportunities for training, and that training needs to be done in-house in the federal public service, because if it's privatized, it's going to cause more problems. We need to bring that in-house.
Okay. And now, we know that workers in Canada are facing very difficult times, and we know that the PSAC has always been a strong supporter of anti-scab legislation, which, of course, the NDP spearheaded in Parliament earlier this year. I'd like to hear from you. Does the Conservative Party position opposing anti-scab legislation historically, despite the blip we saw on the voting record just recently, worry your union membership? And can you speak to how important anti-scab legislation is to supporting working people, whether in the public service, the federally regulated workplace, and beyond?
Absolutely. We have members on strike right now in non-public funds, CFMWS, who've been on strike for 67 days as of today. They're being replaced by scab labor from DND. Active military personnel are doing their work. Active military are being forced or being ordered to do scab labor. And of course, it's a huge concern to our member. I think the largest gap in the current anti-scab legislation being proposed by the federal government is that it doesn't include workers in the federal government. So definitely that needs to be expanded, and I think we need to go further and pass anti-scab laws provincially as well. The right to unionize, the right to organize, the right to strike should be protected in Canada, and so legislation like this not only needs to be implemented, but needs to be expanded.
Okay, merci beaucoup pour ce message.
Thank you very much for that clear message. Chair, how much time do I have left? 1 minute. Excellent. So finally, I'd like to come back to this question of language learning, language training in English or in French. You've talked about the need to bring these services back inside the public service. Could you reiterate, please, that recommendation once again for us? Absolutely is the response. So when it comes to identifying the specific needs of the public service, the workers within the public service are best placed to understand the situation here. In the short term, it might seem that outsourcing is going to save money, but in reality, in the long term, it costs more to Canadian taxpayers and it costs more for the population in general. So bringing these services in-house within the core public service will lead to better training, to better develop bilingual capacities within the public service, and in the long term, it will be a good investment for the population as a whole. Thank you, Mr. Silas, and thank you, Ms. Ashton. So now we've got a 5-minute question round. First of all, Mr. Bernard Généreux. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses, Ms. Tellier. First of all, I'd like to thank you and congratulate you for your excellent career. I follow you and I read your columns, and I've always found that you've got very fair viewpoints, even if you're a bit harsh with the Conservatives in general, but that's fine. Yes, he's reading what you write. Now, you were hard with the Liberals and harsh with the Liberals this morning, and I agree with you when you said that the way in which the Liberals have proceeded with appointments have sent out the wrong signal in the last few years. And we need to remedy this in the future. And Mr. Iacono was talking at the same time as I was talking, the way in which he put his question earlier, I imagine basically shows the Liberal thinking on this. So we've got a 40 million population in Canada. Are we not able to find people who are bilingual and competent, or perhaps even trilingual? I've just recruited someone who speaks 4 languages. That's young people today. They're increasingly open to all of these different languages. And in Canada, we know that there are parents who line up for 24 hours outside to be able to sign up their kids into French immersion school. There's a real movement amongst the population, in particular amongst young people, to learn English and or French, and in particular French, of course. So what do you think about this approach, this liberal approach where they want to appoint people that are unfortunately not bilingual? We are, after all, a bilingual country. De facto, we are the 2 founding peoples of Canada. So it should be something automatic. How do you explain this mismatch? I don't understand that disconnect either. And when I arrived in Ottawa, quite some time ago, I won't say how many years ago, and I arrived in a bilingual institution, the University of Ottawa, and I was struck to see that there wasn't a great deal of bilingualism. And I'll draw a parallel with the University of Ottawa to see how this could then be applied to the public service context. French and research, that's always a problem. We say, yes, we can have research, we can have excellent researchers who speak French, but there's always opposition, and say either you're an excellent researcher or you speak French, but you can't do both. And that's actually a false debate, a false premise. And then to come back to the Canadian population, we've got 40 million inhabitants, so we should be able to find bilingual people. It should be seen as an asset, but I think there's a pedagogical effort to be made earlier in life to learn early on that we are a bilingual country and that you need to have competence in both languages, and also learn this at university. When I was listening to one of the questions earlier, I was thinking to myself that it would be very good if the public service could reach out to universities and say, look, I need bilingual candidates, in particular when it comes to public administration programs. That was an idea that I'd launched in our university, but it wasn't taken up. Why, when it comes to these language tests, if you come from a bilingual university where it's proven that you've taken courses in English and French, surely that could replace the language test. It wouldn't be complicated to set that up, but you need to people who think about these aspects, think outside the box, and see how are we going to save money and make this a more efficient system, send out this type of message that's missing at the moment. We're working in silos. That's what happens. The public service, everybody's in their little corner, and in Quebec it's in French, and in the rest of the country it's in English. That's basically the overall vision. And in other bilingual institutions, it's kind of like that things work as well. No doubt you've followed the debate on the adoption of the new Act on C13, Official Languages Act. It hadn't been renewed for the past 50 years. So how do you think this new act will beef things up, or we hope it will beef up bilingualism in Canada? Within this act, do you think there are certain mechanisms that will allow us to improve the situation of French in Canada? You have 20 seconds to answer that. Yes. Yes, because there'll be a bilingualism requirement for certain positions, and we've got the Commission of Official Languages. But as I said previously, if we're not actually active to implement this quickly, and if we don't have strong leadership across the board, then we may well find ourselves back in the previous situation once again. Thank you very much, Ms. Tellier. And the next 5 minutes will come from Mr. Drouin. Please go ahead. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you. Well, Mr. Iacono was talking because, in fact, he was a public servant when you were in government, Mr. Généreux. So he's still kind of suffering some after effects of that. So to come back to the heart of the matter, Ms. Tellier, you teach public administration, and I'd like to come back to the question of executives and all of these performance agreements. Do you know that whether senior executives are actually paid, or rather have they promoted both languages within their own department? Do you know how that works? And do you think that should be part of their performance-related bonus? Well, I don't know, is my brief answer. Bilingualism bonuses seem to be a problem because you're saying, once again, it's an asset rather than an essential skill. If the position requires bilingualism, then it should be better paid. It's your overall salary that should be strengthened. It should be the best people who've got the best skills who are paid well. Now, I carried out a study for the Quebec Treasury Board on the retention of young people in the public service, and it's not the salary that's the main factor. People are there to work for the common good, and if you're there to work for the common good, then bilingualism is part of the common good. You want to serve the population in both languages, and you also want to ensure that there's use of both languages.
So assuming that the salary or the bonuses will take care of everything, well, I think bonuses is a thing of the past, so I would be more inclined to introduce better overall salary levels because there's competition from the private sector, but you also have assets. There are social advantages and benefits, of course, the work being done. So it's a different way of thinking, and people like that. You can rely on that. And do you need to be bilingual to get to these positions? Yes, of course. And people who want to go into the public service, there are many of them. And if they know that to get to good jobs, they need to be bilingual, then they will be encouraged in that way. Well, the problem is it takes too much time. But when your competition is KPMG or Deloitte or others, government hiring process takes a long time. And right now we have a shortage of talent. We're not really retaining and improving the talent and the young people within our administration. That's a different topic too. Well, that was the same observation for the Quebec Treasury Board. We reached the same conclusions. They have fascinating positions, but it takes 18 months to hire people into those. Well, beyond regulation and beyond the Act, how do we create a culture in the public service where, yes, we speak both languages? And I can give you a very simple example. There are Anglophone MPs who come here to take French courses, but beyond that, going to a social event and speaking and existing there in French and enjoying this, maybe. Are you aware of people who go, okay, yes, we're all Anglophones, but here today we're going to speak French. It's our Francophone day. That might work, but it's about setting the tone. If you are in charge of a team, then you can do that, and you can, of course, it should go to the higher levels. I'll share an anecdote with you. When I was a student, I was doing my internships, and I was offered something at the Department of Finance here in Ottawa. So I had that, and I had Hydro-Québec. I had two options. And I chose Hydro-Québec because they told me that on Wednesday mornings in Ottawa they speak French, so the rest of the week we're just going to be speaking English. And Hydro-Québec, I was in Rouyn-Noranda, so I didn't go to Quebec City or Montreal, but the language aspect of the thing played an important role. This is just a mere anecdote, of course, but you might have those activities, but if you don't believe in them and you're doing it because it's an obligation, then it's not going to help. You need to be Francophile, not just Francophone. So beyond the act, beyond the regulation, what do we do? Well, being Francophile, and if you have a recruitment procedure where you recognize these people who are sensitive towards French, who are Francophiles, then you will end up enriching your human resources pool. Thank you. For 2 minutes and 2.5 minutes, Mr. Beaulieu, you have the floor. I will talk about the elephant in the room because we keep talking about bilingualism. But when the Official Languages Act was before us, we were talking about this as part of C13. There are collective and territorial language models, Belgium, Switzerland, etc. And then the other model that protects the minority language is the model rather that does this is this model, and Mr. Trudeau chose institutional bilingualism, and we ended up with this decline of the French language at every level, and it's speeding up. And in federal institutions, if we try to make the French the common language in the main territories where you have a majority of Francophones, then that allows people to function in French. But right now we're in situations where Francophones are the minority, and at the end of the day, the English dominates. What do you think about that? The minority status is fragile. We remain a minority, so it will take particular arrangements to deal with that. Well, we should also ask the following question. How do we define bilingualism? What do we mean by that? Does that mean everyone should speak both languages? Does that mean every person can work in their language? If you say every Canadian can work or live in French or English and doesn't have to speak the other while you are in a bilingual country and the two are coexisting. Very quickly, if you look at Belgium in the Flanders region, Dutch is not menaced, even though it's a minority language, and the federal government is bilingual. But here we have bilingualism everywhere, allegedly, but it doesn't function. Francophones outside Quebec, and even Quebec right now. I mean, are we not going to see this in a different light? Because they have a different model, the territoriality model, or a model based on the territories. That's an excellent question, Mr. Beaulieu, but it will have to wait the next round, if there is a next round. Ms. Ashton, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes. We're not hearing you, Ms. Ashton.
Pardon.
Can you hear me now? Okay. My question will be for the Public Service Alliance of Canada. We have heard rumors that the Coast Guard is hiring unilingual Anglophones to work in Quebec. Well, what does that mean for the Coast Guard employees in Quebec and for this essential service? Thank you for the question. We have heard this through our members who work for the Coast Guard in Quebec. Well, the highest level of management is an Anglophone speaker, is an Anglophone, unilingual Anglophone. And sometimes you have people who have French as their mother tongue being forced to work in English without the supports and the formation at work, so they are not feeling very comfortable working in the language of their choice at work. Okay, thank you. That's especially worrying given the nature of the work the Coast Guard does. It's essential, and recently we also heard that within the RCMP system, there are problems with translation and interpretation, which again result from, or rather have the result of not communicating the information in both official languages in due time. Do you think that this lack of bilingualism and people not speaking French, especially in Quebec, or in other parts of the country where French is spoken, could that have negative impacts when it comes to relaying essential information that Canadians need? Absolutely. And we hear from our members, they say that there are two official languages in the Federal Public Service. It's English and interpretation. So when it comes to emergency services, it should be communicated in both official languages as soon as possible, not just first in English and then in French after translation after a couple of hours. We have heard examples from our members internally. Communication is usually sent in English first and then French after. And then externally as well, when it comes to important communication, public-facing communication, these are done in English first, and then Francophones end up waiting more. Thank you, Mr. Silas. Thank you, Ms. Ashton. 2 other rounds of 3 minutes. Mr. Godin, you have the floor for the next 3 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go back to Ms. Tellier on my question from the previous round. We have made the observation, and I think we agree on the analysis, but what do we do now, us as lawmakers, to stop the decline of French? Because English might be declining compared to other languages, but we have a French and English bilingual country, and the only one of these two who is in danger is French. So what would you recommend? Of course, faster implementation is one thing you underlined, but if you have other recommendations, that will be valuable. Thank you. That's a very good question indeed. The challenge here is that you are lawmakers, so you are not directly managing the programs. You are here for accountability purposes, and it's on the accountability front that you can work as lawmakers. So putting pressure on the government, putting pressure on the public servants, and the lawmakers can ask, of course, for certain things. For instance, you can ask for a report on progress made, and you can force the government to explain the steps they are taking. You cannot replace the government, but you can certainly ask questions. That is why your committee is in an interesting position, because we're still talking about appointments, and the Commissioner of Official Languages was telling you, and you can interface with him as well. You can ask questions and follow up on different matters. So you can do this regularly, ask for status updates, and to really hit the nail on the head and keep putting pressure. And sometimes asking hard questions is also a part of your role. Now, you also talked about statistics and data. In the Official Languages Act, well, as part of it, we actually presented a motion that in the next census, this relevant question should be included, but the Liberals were against. In 2021, we fought against the Liberals again that this should be a part of the population census. So we don't have the data, and when you calculate something and when you have right holders, there is a financial impact on our communities, in the official language minority communities. That is a fact. It's an observation. What do you think about that? Well, I might speak to this more in the public service framework. The Commissioner said that we don't have the data. We should really dig deep and ask these questions on the ground to people, as the union was saying, well, can you work in French? And getting this information and seeing the trends over time will be valuable. So internally, you should have this sort of data. Thank you, Ms. Tellier. The clock is ticking, and we're going to Mr. Makisere for 3 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses for your recommendations to our committee. The study that is before us has been requested by the Commissioner of Official Languages, and it focuses more on public servants and on the different staffing and appointment processes. You have formulated good recommendations, and Ms. Tellier, you referred to senior public servants, and you talked about definitions. How do we define bilingualism? At the University of Ottawa, at the Laurentian University, for instance, these are bilingual institutions allegedly, but they are not really bilingual institutions. They offer courses in French, but you drew parallels between different institutions, the University of Ottawa and the senior public service levels. So what can we do? Of course, we have the hiring phase, and we heard from a labor union representative that that for French, the assumption is that they will receive training later on. So I'd like to hear you speak to this point a little bit more. Well, I think I said this, but I'll repeat it. French is an essential skill, and it's not an asset. It shouldn't be at the bottom of the list, as is often the case. And if I am to draw a parallel with the University of Ottawa, when it comes to hiring, we see that unilingual Anglophone professors are hired more often than bilingual professors. It takes leadership, and people have to know that if they want to have access to positions that are interesting, they have to speak 2 languages. So we are talking about the higher echelons. As soon as you enter the public service, this is something you're faced with. And if you say, okay, I'm going to be a DG or a deputy minister at some point, then I need to speak to 2 languages, and that will encourage people to learn and speak to both languages. And it takes a clear policy when it comes to implementing the rules around the 2 official languages, and that should be concentrated around the Treasury Board, and the general parameters should be determined by them, and then each department or the agency will add their own rules. Well, the employment of Francophones to higher levels of the public service is important for us too. There should be more opportunities for unilingual Francophones or those with French as their mother tongue, because the higher levels of senior management, unilingual English speaker, that's okay, bilingual, that's okay, but unilingual French speaker is no good. Thank you very much. We were able to get 2 rounds of questions in. I'd like to thank our witnesses who were with us this morning. Well, I was very strict about timing, but that allowed us to do 2 full rounds of questioning, which is very rare. I interrupted you as the chair on a number of occasions, but if there are elements that you were not able to share with us, please do so in writing. That is key when we are drafting our report. So if you want to add anything that you did not have the time to share with us, please do so. Send it to our clerk. Thank you very, very much. This has been very interesting, this first panel. We are going to suspend briefly and switch over to the second panel. Thank you very much.
So welcome to the next panel of witnesses. So for the Privy Council, got Ms. Marcia Jones, Director General Strategies and Planning, and Rima Amoui, who's the Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Senior Personnel. And then for the Treasury Board Secretary, Mr. Karsten Quell, who's already come before as Executive Director of the Official Languages Centre of Excellence Office of the Chief HR Officer, and also Karim Adam, Director Oversight and Compliance, Official Languages Centre of Excellence. And then for the Canada Border Services Agency, Holly Flowers Code, Vice President, Human Resources. And as you know, I give you 5 minutes, that's a maximum, so that you can make your presentation. And then we'll go into rounds of questions with interactive answers. So we'll start with Ms. Jones for 5 minutes. Sorry, Ms. Amoui. Thank you, Chair. Honourable members, good morning. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the lands on which we are gathered are part of the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. On behalf of my colleague and myself, we appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss official language obligations related to Governor and Council appointments. I will provide you with a brief overview of the role of the Senior Personnel Secretariat within the Privy Council Office in helping to manage and coordinate the process for these appointments.
Include heads and members of commissions, boards, agencies, administrative tribunals, crown corporations, as well as deputy ministers and associate deputy ministers leading federal public service departments. Bilingualism is a fundamental responsibility of federal institutions, and Governor and Council appointees play important roles in carrying out the mandates of these organizations. Les nominations par le
Governor and Council appointments are made by the Governor-General on the advice of Cabinet and on the recommendation of the responsible minister. Since 2016, the government has used open, transparent and merit-based selection processes to support ministers in making recommendations for these appointments. This approach is intended to support the identification of highly qualified candidates who meet the skill, knowledge and experience criteria of a position, and who also reflect Canada's diversity in terms of linguistic, regional and employment equity groups.
These are application-based. Positions are advertised through notices of opportunity on the Privy Council Office website. Federal departments conduct outreach to attract qualified candidates. Applications are assessed against the advertised criteria for the position. And following interviews, a list of qualified candidates is provided to the responsible minister who recommends a candidate to Cabinet. The Privy Council Office provides the necessary support for this process. En vertu de la loi sur les compétences.
Under the Language Skills Act, agents and officers of Parliament who are appointed by the Governor and Council are legally required to be bilingual prior to their appointment. The language proficiency of candidates for those positions is assessed during the interview stage of a selection process, and if necessary, can also be assessed through language testing provided by the House of Commons.
Governor and Council appointees that are not subject to the Language Skills Act, the notices of opportunity posted for those positions note the preference for bilingual proficiency, and individuals are asked to include in their application their ability to speak and understand their second official language. Applicants are interviewed in the official language of their choice and may be asked to answer one or more questions in their second official language to assess their bilingual proficiency. The Privy Council Office tracks bilingual proficiency in the Governor and Council community and monitors trends to help support decision makers. Le comité est certainement au courant.
The committee will be aware of the recent amendment to the Official Languages Act, which impacts deputy ministers and associate deputy ministers appointed on the recommendation of the Prime Minister based on advice from the Clerk of the Privy Council. Section 34(2) under Part 5 of the Act requires individuals appointed to a deputy minister position that falls under Schedule 1 of the Financial Administration Act to take the language training that is necessary to be able to speak and understand clearly both official languages. This legislative provision reinforces the terms and conditions of appointment for deputy ministers, which include that they personally promote the use of both official languages in their institutions.
Secretariat supports the Clerk of the Privy Council in overseeing the Deputy Minister community, including ensuring that they are aware of their individual responsibilities under the Official Languages Act. Deputy ministers are often promoted from the assistant deputy minister level within the federal public service and would be subject to valid proficiency levels in their second official language. Les personnes recrutées de l'extérieur de la fonction publique.
Individuals who are recruited from outside the federal public service are made aware of their legislative responsibilities, including with respect to official languages, as part of their terms and conditions of employment. In closing, I'd like to emphasise the Privy Council Office is committed to supporting the Governing Council as it strives to create a community of leaders that is reflective of today's Canada.
We would be pleased to take your questions.
Merci, Madame Amouy. Pour le secrétariat du...
Thank you very much for the Treasury Board. I believe now it's Mr. Quell for 5 minutes.
To appear before the committee here today. Je suis accompagné de Karim Adam.
With me today is Karim Adam, as you've said, Director Monitoring and Compliance at the Official Languages Centre of Excellence. Today, in my brief remarks, I would like to provide some key information on the bilingualism of federal government executives. Our two official languages are at the heart of the Canadian identity. They contribute to the values of diversity and inclusion, and bilingualism is a priority for the Government of Canada. One of the reasons that this is a priority is the right of Canadians to receive services from the government in either official language. This is a fundamental right, and our department is committed to ensuring that it is respected. A public service and institutional leadership committed to bilingualism can best meet the needs of Canadians to receive services in both languages.
Federal public servants in bilingual regions for language of work purposes have the right to work in the language of their choice. We are committed to fostering a workplace that is conducive to the use of both English and French. D'ailleurs, la loi modernisée renforce.
Moreover, the Modernised Act strengthens and broadens the Treasury Board Secretariat's monitoring responsibilities in order to improve and maintain federal institutions' compliance with their official languages obligations, including obligations relating to service delivery and communications with the public and those relating to respect for employees' language of work rights.
Executives play a key role in setting the tone for the regular use of both official languages in the workplace. And, as you know, amendments to Part 5 of the Official Languages Act address the bilingual capacity, as we just heard, of deputy ministers and associate deputy ministers, as well as language of work rights of employees in bilingual regions. My colleague from the Privy Council Office has just spoken to that. La responsabilité du secrétariat du Conseil.
The Treasury Board Secretariat's responsibility extends up to the Assistant Deputy Minister level, meaning the level below Deputy Ministers. Most appointments to Deputy Minister positions are made from within the public service, in particular by candidates from the pool of Assistant Deputy Ministers. The Directive on Official Languages for People Management requires that Assistant Deputy Minister positions be designated with a language profile of superior proficiency and that the incumbents of these positions be bilingual at the time of their appointment. Amongst the 6,000 executives, 85%, including assistant deputy ministers, actually meet the requirements for their post, and that was in 2023. If we now look at the situation from an employee's point of view, when there was a survey carried out amongst employees in 2022. 3/4 indicated that senior managers in their department use both official languages in their interactions with employees. Perceptions are very similar between Francophones, lying at 75%, and Anglophones at 76%. So that gives you a quick snapshot of the current situation.
Despite a solid foundation for bilingualism, I would like to stress that official languages do need ongoing support, and that we must be constantly vigilant so that the rights of Canadians and of public servants are respected. Je vais m'arrêter ici, puis la parole.
I'll stop here, and I will give the floor to my colleague from the CBSA. So now Ms. Flowers-Jones says the speaker from the CBSA. Good morning, Mr. Chair, honourable members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Holly Flowers Code, and I am the Vice President of Human Resources at the Canada Border Services Agency and champion of official languages at the agency. The CBSA is the front line of our nation's borders, serving as the face of Canada for many newcomers, international travellers who arrive, and also returning Canadians. However, we are not just the gatekeepers of our borders, we are also the custodians of our country's rich heritage and culture. Our two official languages, English and French, are a central piece of this heritage. They light the heart of what makes us Canadian. Together with the Indigenous languages, they are a powerful symbol of our country's diverse and inclusive society.
Understand and recognize the significance of linguistic duality in defining our national identity, fostering social inclusion, and ensuring effective communication with the public and the clients we serve. As the federal agency with the mandate of protecting our borders and providing integrated border services, we strive to ensure that our services are provided of equal quality in both official languages at all our bilingual ports of entry. Travelers and clients are provided active offers of service to use one of our two official languages when interacting with our border services officers and are able to receive documents in the official language of their choice. Every year, the CBSA serves over 95 million people, and in a 2020 Ipsos poll, 98% of respondents indicated that they receive services in the official language of their choice. Plus récemment, au cours de l'exercice.
More recently, in the 2023-2024 fiscal year, the CBSA received 35 official language complaints to date, representing almost half of what was received in the prior year. Two-thirds of our complaints come from members of the public and generally concern the lack of an active offer of service or continuity of service in the traveller's preferred official language. As a large organisation that has 135 bilingual points of service, we face challenges when it comes to recruiting and maintaining sufficient bilingual resources for all areas, particularly as some of our ports of entry are in remote regions. To address this, the CBSA has put in place a shift scheduling system with the ability to identify the linguistic profile of employees in order to prioritise the scheduling of bilingual border services officers at ports of entry when required.
Fully bilingual services by telephone for those reaching out to Border Information Services line, at our primary inspection kiosks, on our social media channels, as well as on our external website. Within the agency, we also work to ensure sufficient bilingual capacity across the organization so that employees can work in the official language of their choice in bilingual regions. In the 2020 Public Service Employee Survey, 92% of respondents from the CBSA indicated they could communicate with their immediate supervisor in the official language of their choice. À l'interne, nous avons une école et un programme de formation linguistique spécifique.
Internally, we have a dedicated language training school program, and each year we train between 500 to 800 employees to increase our agency's bilingual capacity. Our commitment does not stop at training. We are continually striving to create a work environment that promotes the use of both English and French. We encourage our employees to use their preferred official language in their workplace and regularly share reminders and implement training requirements so that employees are aware of their official language's obligations.
I'd like to assure the Chair and members of the committee that the CBSA remains dedicated to serving Canadians in the official language of their choice. We are fully committed to upholding the principles of linguistic duality, not as a legal obligation, but also as a vital part of our national identity. I look forward to the discussion and insight today on ways we can further enhance our commitment to promoting and preserving our nation's linguistic heritage. Merci. Je suis heureuse de répondre à vos questions.
Merci, Madame Flowers.
Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. So everyone stuck to their timing so we can take as many questions as possible, and each political group will have 6 minutes of questions and answers, and we'll start with the Conservatives. Mr. Gaudin, over to you for 6 minutes. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for being here today and participating in this exercise. It's very important to mention that to you. We want to improve, and you're the ones who live out the regulations and legislation on a daily basis. So thank you very much for being here. I'll turn to Mr. Quell first of all. I'd like to ask you what has changed Since the adoption of the Official Languages Act in the daily life of workers in bilingualism and the commitment of, or rather the hiring of employees who speak French. Thank you very much for the question. I'd like to answer by saying that our commitment is constant vis-a-vis official languages in terms of public service. No, I don't want to know about your commitment, but I want to know specifically what has changed since Royal Assent was given to C13 that then entered into force. What has changed in your daily lives in the Treasury Board? Well, in our group, that's brought about important changes because we have got new responsibilities now, and I'm going to name two main initiatives underway at the moment. One of these is making of a regulation on Part 7, and that was mentioned in the previous contribution made. So we have regular meetings with the Commissioner for Official Languages and people from the OLMCs to prepare the regulations on Part 7. So that's one initiative that's underway. Then another initiative on which we're working is a framework of responsibilities and accountability, and we're planning to publish that over the summer. And a third initiative that I'd like to mention is the setting up of a new framework on language training. That's a commitment from the government that dates back to 2019 to develop that type of framework to improve the offer of language training for employees. So these are three initiatives that fall under the responsibility of my particular group. Thank you, Mr. Quill. Another question. In your speech, you talked about openness, and you said that 95% of people meet the bilingualism requirements. So how have you carried out that analysis and gathered these data? It's through the centralized HR systems that we do this. So each holder of a bilingual position has to take a test for the centralized public administration that's administered by the Public Service Commission or Board. So when does this evaluation take place? It's during their application process when we're assessing the candidates' suitability for these positions that are covered as imperative staffing. And that's the biggest case. We're talking about imperative staffing. Now, you've been talking about deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers that have to follow training to become more bilingual. What is the method to assess these people now that they've been hired? Well, I'd like to give the floor to my colleague. You're talking about assistant deputy ministers and associate deputy ministers. Yes, that falls under the Treasury Board's responsibilities then. Thank you for that question, Chair. So the deputy ministers and the associate deputy ministers, the big majority of them, come from within the public service context. So they're already subject to certain bilingual level requirements for the position that they held beforehand. And once they take up this new position, the conditions for their appointment mean that personally, they have to promote and respect the use of both official languages within their organizations. I understand that, Ms. Amouy, but I'd like to know what happens for these people who are hired, for example, as a deputy minister or an assistant deputy minister. How are they assessed? Do you leave them free in the system once they're hired? That's it? There's no other assessment? No, there's no centralized assessment. That's correct. Now, do you not think that the bilingualism assessment downstream is too strict or not strict enough or too demanding? So basically, I'd like to know from you whether we should actually increase the criteria in terms of knowledge of French, because in general, that's the most vulnerable language where there's the most problems. So don't you think we should actually increase the level of knowledge when they actually first take up this position?
Monsieur Président.
Mr. Chair, I can't provide my opinion on whether it needs to be increased, the level, or not, but in the Federal Public Service, there is a required bilingualism level that is quite strict in oral and written expression and oral comprehension, and that is expected of deputy ministers and associate deputy ministers. Once they are in these positions with the changes in the Act, they need to take the necessary training to make sure that they understand both official languages. I do understand, Ms. Amoui. Your 6 minutes are up. I know it goes by quickly. Mr. Sanson, for the Liberals, for the next 6 minutes, you have the floor. Thank you. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here as well and helping us better understand where we are and where we are going. Very quickly, Ms. Amoui, I heard that there are fewer appointments, Francophone appointments, over the past years. Is that true? It is exactly for this reason that the Privy Council office is collecting data to see if there are trends. As we speak, when it comes to governor and council appointments in general, I think the current number is 23% of people who identify French as their first official language. And has there been a decrease compared to a couple years ago? The data fluctuates month over month or year over year. Okay, thank you. In connection with C13, the deputy minister and associate deputy minister have to be bilingual. Have there been appointments made or hiring made in line with the new rules, with the changes to the Act, you mean? So deputy ministers and associate deputy ministers have to take the necessary training to make sure that they understand both official language after their nominations, after their appointments, so they can still be appointed even though they're not bilingual right now, even with C13. Yes, okay, that's interesting. Okay, a second question. I'm happy to have representation from the Treasury Board here today, Mr. Coyle, because there was a lady who was here before, and I liked his contributions a lot. So this person was saying that the more we wait to implement C13, the lower the chance that we will really improve the legislation or the practices. Is that the case? I mean, each piece of legislation needs to be implemented as quickly as possible. I agree with that. Having said that, there is a certain procedure for the regulation. I referred to the regulation on Part 7 of the Act, and I was before this committee with the President of the Treasury Board, where she referred to the time it takes, to the deadlines, and implementation should be done after consultation with the stakeholders and the public. Thank you, I understand, and I appreciate your answer. Can we get a sample or an organizational chart of some sort of what needs to be done in the first month, 6 months, and in a year? Of course, implementation takes a certain amount of time. If it's longer than a year, then it starts to worry me, and I've heard rumors that that is the case. And what are some examples of the low-hanging fruit, and what can be done in the first month, 6 months for the first year, or will it take 2 to 3 years to implement the regulation? We started the regulation drafting procedure. We know the steps to follow. We are in pre-consultation with stakeholders, minority communities, and the Commissioner of Official Languages. The next step will be the presentation of a regulation to the Parliament, which will be studied by your committee, among others. Thank you. I appreciate that. Can we get a flow chart of how things will move forward? I know that Canadian Heritage and yourselves, you work together. and you are jointly responsible for the new act. Where are you on that? I can give you an example. C13 stipulates that the governance will be done by the Treasury Board. Starting from the next fiscal year, the Secretariat of the Treasury Board will be responsible through this committee of a high-level committee on official languages. So we are getting this responsibility from Canadian Heritage. I appreciate your answer. It's not to criticize you or attack you. It is so that all Canadians are able to see what's happening. So can we get another chart for that on the transition and how much more time it will take to finish it? We can definitely provide you with some information on the governance and the transition between the Canadian Heritage and the Treasury Board. You referred to the framework of responsibilities and the report on official languages. Can you please provide us an update on that aspect of things? We can certainly provide information on the framework. We're still developing it, and we can definitely provide information. My concern is that Canadians are asking the question, when will it be done? When will we see the new powers? 10 seconds, Mr. Sanson. When will the Commissioner receive or start exercising the new powers? Thank you, Mr. Sanson. That's an excellent question, but your time is up. That's fine. We're going to the Bloc Québécois. 6 minutes, Mr. Beaulieu. You have the floor. My first question will be for the CBSA. Recently, there was a Bloc Québécois MP who was not able to get services in French from a security agent in Montreal. And had they not been a member of the parliament, I think they would have had a lot of problem. So they insisted, and they were taken in custody, and they missed their trip. So what would you say on problems like that? And this was in Montreal, and you were saying that you're having a hard time finding people, bilingual people in remote regions, but in Quebec and Montreal, these are not remote regions.
And I'm very sorry to hear that we didn't meet this standard for Canadians, and in particular this traveler. Certainly happy to take the details back. We are committed, and we do have a scheduling system to ensure that we have bilingual capacity at all of our bilingual ports of entry. But from time to time, we have border service officers that would have family emergencies, would be sick. And so we do have backups. We do have phone services to provide when the bilingual capacity cannot be provided at that time. But we are committed and happy to take that away and look at that situation.
I'm happy to hear that you will look into it, but it did not appear to be an exception. The agents were not very happy when they were faced with requests to receive services in French. That was the impression. So there was a lawyer who was prohibited from making their case in French. They were defending their client, and after complaints, they were granted the right, but they refused written submissions in French, but that was then finally accepted. So the CBSA agent, I think, provided a written document, a piece of evidence, but that was then withdrawn. So it seems like there are problems in Montreal with cases like that, and we were told that it was caused, or the underlying cause was with the CBSA. I don't know if you heard about such cases, but in Montreal, it seems that there are many issues, many problems.
Thank you again for the question. Certainly happy to take certain specific situations back to take a look at them. That should not be the case. We do have bilingual capacity at all of our bilingual ports of service, and we have supervisors and we have backup. It doesn't seem that this individual got the service they should have, and that should be corrected.
Bon. Il s'agira de regarder, on a eu un témoin ici.
We had a witness here, an immigration lawyer, who was saying that, and they've been here for 30 years, and they're saying that the situation isn't improving and that it's worsening continuously. So we will see what will happen going forward, but it doesn't look like there will be improvements. I hope that you will carry the message to the agency so that there are improvements. Now, we've also seen recently with appointments to key positions in the government that there has been a new low of when it comes to francophones. There has been fewer appointments, francophone appointments, compared to recent years. How do you explain that? Mr. Chair, the data we collect fluctuate from month to month, from year to year. Just to give you a bit more of a context, we're looking at 2,200 positions that need to be filled in through governor and council appointments, and we do 500 to 800 appointments every year. So every time we make nominations, or appointments rather, the data will vary. We are currently at 23% of individuals appointed through governor and council appointments who identify French as their first spoken official language. And when it comes to leadership positions, we have 31% of people who identify French as their first language. So once again, we'll look at the data. We provide recommendations to decision makers to prevent negative trends. And we're trying to diagnose the situation specifically to understand what's happening. I do understand that you're officials and that you cannot criticize or take political positions, but other stakeholders who are not in your shoes seem to be saying that it's not really great, the situation. So people, I don't know what position this was for specifically, but answering a question by my colleague, you said that people do not need to be bilingual before they're appointed. So some people who don't speak French before their appointments, 15 seconds, who have the skills for, and then they end up receiving training, but it doesn't work out. If you'll allow me to clarify, you have 5 seconds. Well, there are different positions with different criteria. That's what it boils down to. Some positions, people need to be bilingual when they're appointed. In some others, it's not essential, but it's preferred. Okay, thank you very much. Next round of questions, we're going to the NDP. Ms. Ashton, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our witnesses. My first question will be to Mr. Qual and Mr. Adam. We received a question about the functioning of responsibilities among different departments. What's the difference between the Excellency Center, Center of Excellence of the Treasury Board and the center that is in charge of Part 7 under Canadian Heritage as part of the Action Plan for Official Languages? And will this have an impact on appointments going forward? Thank you. I'll start with the last bit of your question. There will not be an impact on the appointment structure. To answer your question on the difference between the two, at the Treasury Board, we are responsible for the federal institutions. So, for the most part, we are trying to ensure the good functioning of the public service. The Canadian Heritage Centre, on Part 7 of the Act, they focus more on mobilizing information among minority communities. Canadian Heritage also has a responsibility to interface with the provinces and territories. So that is more external facing. But the center that I am in charge of at the Treasury Board, our function is more internal for the public service. Do you think that this might have an impact on appointments in the future? despite this clear distinction? I don't believe so. The Official Languages Center of Excellence, so within our organization, we are responsible for Part 5 of the Act, Language of Work. So we are looking into respecting the language choices of employees and appointments that has to do with the Public Service Commission, but we are checking compliance for the most part. And if I can specify, Mr. Chair, Canadian Heritage Centre, that the centre is focused on Part 7, so that has to do with external stakeholders, and it also has to do with the regulations in connection with Part 7, as my colleague mentioned previously. Thank you. Okay, great. Again, my question to you, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, in negotiations with the Treasury Board, asked for a revision of the bilingualism bonus. They're asking for the bonus to go from $800 to $3,000 in 2024. $800 with the current cost of living isn't really much for many people because people are finding themselves in difficult situations. So would that encourage more bilingual people to join the public service or help others master the 2 official languages? And what do you think about the bonus not having been changed since 1977? And what kind of an impact this would have on a more dynamic public service? Thank you. If you'll allow me, I'll give a bit of some context. So the bonus was introduced in 1977 with the objective of serving as, or rather serving as a tool to encourage bilingual employees. So this is, of course, a different time. Now the directive is the responsibility of the National Joint Committee. Employers and labor unions are represented there. The employer and the labor unions agreed to review the bilingualism bonus as part of the next review, which will start in April. So the bonus was discussed in the past as well, and you heard this from Ms. Tellier as well. In 2002, the Commissioner of Official Languages said that English and French skills should be considered as base skills, similar to other professional skills that are required, and they asked to the bonus to be taken out of the system. And then in 2005, there was another recommendation to abolish the bonus and that the 2 official languages should be taken into account in setting the salary levels of public servants. So just to provide some background on the bonus, but we will look into the bonus once again as part of the negotiations in April. Okay. Well, we hope that there will be some changes in line with what the Public Service Alliance of Canada have been asking for. And, of course, French is on the decline in Canada. We are faced with great challenges when it comes to the number of French speakers throughout the country, and I hope that all the efforts to strengthen the bill, well, rather the Official Languages Act now, will give us the opportunity to revisit some of these elements and, more importantly, to increase this bonus. Thank you, Ms. Ashton. Thank you. Thank you. You went beyond your time. Ms. Kuzi, for 5 minutes. Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you to the witnesses. Thank you for being here today. I'm a product of language training in the public service. I arrived here in Ottawa in 2003 as a young girl from Alberta, and I took 15 months of language training, and it was a bit of a nightmare. But I think that back then they used a certain organization that was called CITI in order to provide the language training. So, Mr. Quell, I've got some questions on language training for you. So there seems to be subcontracting of language training within departments rather than creating an internal language training program. Do you think that this subcontracting process has actually led to cost savings, but perhaps lesser quality? I'd like to answer by saying that the way in which departments provide language training is quite variable. There are certain departments, social affairs, natural resources, Health Canada, for example, and I think also the CBSA, who use public servants as language teachers because they've decided that it's more profitable, more beneficial to have a language school, if you like, within their own department. It depends on the size of the department whether they're able to do that, of course. So Public Services and Procurement Canada have set up certain standing offers which allow departments to choose from pre-qualified language schools. So these are basically the two models that exist and are used by departments to make sure that we have correct language training offered to employees. And which verifications or audits have been carried out to make sure that language training maintains the same level of quality throughout the federal public service. So there are these standing offers that I've just mentioned from PSPC. And in these standing offers, there are criteria about the cost and also the quality of the training provided. So providers are assessed to make sure that it's high-quality training. Now, for the internal schools, well, it's the responsibility of the department to make sure that these employees actually provide quality training. I received this question from my colleague, mainly people in certain positions covered under Part 4 of the OLA can actually draw on an exception to official languages, as we see under 34.2 of Part 5 of the OLE. So the point here, for example, I received a bilingualism bonus because I was at level CCC, but it took me 50 months to get there, but I did get there, cheer. But how much of time would it take for people to get this level that's needed for the position, and how is this decided? If we can say that it's acceptable to have someone who would take 2 years to reach the necessary level of this type of position, well, how would that work? Well, it falls to the public service, and it's there under the authority that would give an exemption to the linguistic requirements. Now, the number of positions where there are no linguistic requirements attached are non-imperative positions, and it's quite low. We're just talking about 1 or 2% of the appointments here. But when it's the case, what we do is that we give the employee 2 years to learn their second language. And during this period, the department has to make sure that employees' rights are respected. So we make sure that there should be a colleague that would supervise or rather take up the duties of this employee who's following language training. Sometimes it's a question of taking someone from a level BBB up to CCC. So we're not saying these people are not bilingual, but they need to step up to a higher level of bilingual competence. Thank you. And now Mr. Seri for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses once again for having being here today to help us with this particular situation. First of all, on the basis of the comments that have been received, there needs to be more coordination with language training because we've heard that it doesn't work when it's spread across different departments. So I hope that we're able to improve things and centralize things. And earlier, my young colleague, Mr. Drouin, said that sometimes people are waiting for 10 months to be hired or more for these vacant positions. That's not acceptable. People can find something quicker in the private sector. So we're losing many bilingual young people who decide to go elsewhere because the public service takes too much time to hire them. So you need to improve this. Now, to come back to what Madame Cousy just mentioned, and Section 34. And I'd like to thank Mr. Quill and Mr. Adam for having spent months and months with us on C13. I know it was a very enriching experience for you. You've certainly given us a great deal of inspiration over these months. Now, for the Canadians listening to us today, because our study is concentrating on senior officials in the Treasury Board, and you've mentioned 95% as a figure, and that was mentioned by others. So we have the deputy ministers, and then we've got the assistant deputy ministers, associate deputy ministers, and we've got the directors, and afterwards we've got the managers. So there's 4 levels there. So I'd like to know whether C13 applies to all 4 levels and what are the improvements that have been made in terms of these 4 groups of managers who have to immediately supervise their employees. I'll start off and then I'll give the floor to my colleague. So to try and parse all this out, I know it's complicated. We talk about deputy ministers and associate deputy ministers, and they're named by the Treasury Board. That's under Ms. Ambuy's responsibility, so I won't say any more on that. And then when we're talking about the assistant deputy ministers, they are not appointed by the governor in council, so these positions fall under the responsibility of the Treasury Board policies rather than Privy Council. And that's why with these positions, there's a rule that these positions have to be staffed with higher skills and with imperative staffing. And then afterwards, we've got management level positions, the EX, so these executive levels, and below that we have managers. But for all of these different positions that I've just mentioned, under Section 91 of the Act, we have to objectively assess the requirements of the position to determine whether the position is bilingual or not, and if so, at which bilingual level it should be set. And once these people have been appointed, they have to meet the requirements of the position. But perhaps my colleague could respond on the deputy ministers. So for the deputy ministers and the associate deputy ministers, it's a different system. The positions are not described in terms of a linguistic profile. These are people who are appointed by the governor in council, and they have to personally ensure that both official languages are used in their organisation. And with the changes to the Act, the people who are appointed these positions have to take the necessary training to be able to speak and understand both official languages personally, so they can follow training. And I can see that the big majority of deputy ministers are already bilingual. Around 88% of them are already bilingual. And it depends on how many people are promoted through the public service. People come in from outside of the public service also have the same requirement to ensure that both official languages are used and also to follow the necessary required training. So my colleague, Mr. Sanson, would absolutely like to put a last question. 30 seconds. Mr. Adams, I don't want you to feel left out. Now, you're Director of Monitoring and Compliance at the Official Languages Centre of Excellence. What a title. So within 10 or 15 seconds, what's going to change in your role today as a result of C13 compared to the situation last year? Just as a rough outline. That's an excellent question, Mr. Sanson. Well, OK. On you go. Thank you very much, Chair, for that question. Rapidly, it's a new role it's a reinforced and expanded role for the Treasury Board so that there's increased monitoring of the 200 federal institutions we've already got going on this. And also, I don't know if time's going to allow me to explain this, but as well as these new responsibilities that I've just mentioned, there's going to be changes in the annual report when it comes to monitoring of the Parliament. Thank you. That's a very good answer. That's it, Mr. Thompson. So it would be great to get a report to the committee that explains all that. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Now 2.5 minutes for you. Now, when it comes to official languages policy, all of this is based on the idea of institutional bilingualism and people being able to use the language of their choice. What happens if you have a French-speaking and English-speaking worker and both of them want to speak or work in their own language? What happens then? Well, the manager has to be bilingual. That's the brief answer. But you're not answering my question here. If you've got a person who wants to work in French and the other one wants to work in English, what happens if you've got a manager who wants to work in French and the employee wants to work in English? What happens? That does happen in communications between different regions. And that's when you need to turn to the bilingualism of the people involved. Because even in Quebec, in the public service, there is systemic discrimination. People always presume that everything's going to take place in English. And I think if there's not a model where we actually prefer one language, for example, Hockey Canada bans players from speaking French because in an emergency situation there has to be one single language that we use. I think it's the same thing at all levels. So factually, basically everything happens in English unless there's certain areas where it's really French that's the preferred language. So this model isn't working, basically. Chair. Perhaps I could provide some information in terms of the policies that have already been set up. For example, for Quebec, for the federal institutions, apart from the bilingual regions in the Eastern Townships and Montreal, otherwise the language of work for federal institutions in Quebec is French. So how come officials are saying the opposite? They're saying that a great deal of the work takes place in English when they have meetings, they're held in English and so on. So there is a real issue here. I think it's the basic principle and the Official Languages Act that isn't working because it's French that's always being pushed further down the line. If we have an institutional bilingualism model, it's always the majority language that's going to dominate and that will assimilate the minority languages at the end of the day. Thank you. Perhaps I can cite certain survey results from federal employees from 2022. Unfortunately, time has ran out because we have to leave at 10:15 because another committee is coming in. And I'd like to give some time to Ms. Ashton as well. Please go ahead. Thank you. My first question is for Ms. Hamwi or Ms. Jones. We know that in Section 34 of the Modernisation of the OLA, that it stipulates that any person who's appointed by the Governor in Council as Deputy Minister or Associate Deputy Minister or at an equivalent ministerial level mentioned in Schedule so-and-so, when appointed, they have to take language training so that they can understand and speak clearly in both official languages. So how can you guarantee that this actually happens? And amongst the deputy ministers, how many of them are actually bilingual today? Thank you for that question, Chair. First of all, the clerk of the Privy Council has asked all of the current deputy ministers who already have this position to adhere to these modifications in the Act. If they don't perfectly understand both languages, they have to take training. There has to be an annual report provided by them in their performance evaluation as of next year. And for those who have to follow training, they can work through their department or their organisation to be assessed to see whether they need to take training or not, and if they need to take training to actually follow that training course and then report back on it every year. And amongst the deputy ministers, how many of them are bilingual today? 88% of the deputy ministers self-identify as having at least being functionally bilingual. Is there one way for citizens to actually check whether deputy ministers do speak French, and can they get access to that rate of bilingualism? We can give the rate of bilingualism by individual, of course, well, it's confidential information, but the rate of bilingualism is not public knowledge, but we can certainly give that to you. Now, my last question, Mr. Coelho, Mr. Adam, it was mentioned in the Commissioner's report that you need to have a new language training program for employees in the public service. Together with the Office of the Commissioner, where you at with this project, and what are the innovative parts of this program that will make sure that we can ensure bilingualism in an efficient way in the public service? Thank you, but time is really ticking. We have to leave because another committee is coming in. But before we round off, dear witnesses, there have been very relevant questions. We haven't had enough time. It's very difficult for me here to be the hard taskmaster in terms of timing, in particular the questions from Mr. Sanson, Mr. Beaulieu, and the last question from Ms. Ashton. We would really appreciate this, and I would appreciate this as chair, if you could provide us with your answers that you haven't had time to write today. Please send them in before the end of the month. That would give you enough time to do that. Send them in via our clerk, so that these answers can be shared with the committee. And Madame Omi, what does it actually mean, being functionally bilingual? Is it a technical definition? If so, what does that mean? And what are the different tests in order to be functionally bilingual? For example, if you're an Anglophone mother tongue or Francophone mother tongue, and what sort of test do you take to be qualified as functionally bilingual? Having said that, thank you very much. Really appreciated that. Sorry that time ran out, and I'd like to round off by saying that when we come back on the 8th of April, we will take up a year that an hour that we missed because of votes. So we will have 1 hour on this study, and then the second hour we'll be giving instructions to the analysts. Have a great week or two in your ridings. We'll work hard, and thank you once again to the witnesses.